Thank you.
All right. Welcome, everybody, to September 7th, 2017 meeting of Kubernetes SIG service catalog. Aaron says BRB, so Doug, why don't you do your thing? First agenda item. All right. Well, wouldn't want to step on anybody's toes. You want to do your thing then, Aaron?
Do you want me to talk? Hello?
Yeah, go for it, Aaron.
Okay. So normal thing today. I actually wanted to give a very quick announcement that I just put on the document before we start. The poll for the Kubecon 2017 face-to-face has been up for about a week now, a little bit over. We have 88.9% of the votes given for Tuesday. That's December 5th. 8 people voted for that. You can go to the poll. I believe the link is a couple other places below on the agenda. So we are going to meet for a face-to-face on that Tuesday. We'll get a room for that meeting. It'll be able to hold quite a few people. So that's all for me. Just a reminder, we're going to do the speaker queue. I think everyone on this meeting is familiar with how that works, and I will be taking notes. With that, go ahead, Doug.
All right, first on the agenda. So Paul cut a release last night, version 18, and there was a problem with the build process. There was a permission problem, and Kibbles has fixed it. The PR has already been merged. We have some people at IBM are really anxious for the multi-arc images, which is what was not built as a result of last night's error. So what I'd like to do is create another release tonight, version 0019. But I want to make sure that there wasn't any objection to it. You know, the only difference is we're not waiting a week; we're just waiting a day to do it. But we have some internal need to get a power official build out there sooner rather than later. So I want to make sure everybody's okay with me doing that. Is there any objection to creating 0019 tonight?
No objections, but let the record show internal needs were accommodated.
Thank you extremely much. All right. Moving on then. Let's see what's next.
Morgan, looks like you had a hand up. Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to also no objections.
All right, cool.
I'll make that note, Doug.
All right, thank you. And kind of related to that, as I was trying to figure out what was going on with the build last night, I noticed that we have a nightly cron job on Travis that actually just builds master. And I think that might make some sense if we don't have regular things being merged into master. But since we do on a daily basis have at least 1 or 2 PRs merged, it means master will get built on its own every single day. I don't think we need to waste the CPU resources on those machines by doing a nightly cron job. I was wondering if there's any objection to us deleting that nightly cron job, at least for right now.
I'd be okay with it, especially because the number of executors, I believe, is for the incubator org in general, not just our project.
Exactly. Since it's shared, I think it's more important that we clean up after ourselves. Yep. Okay. Not hearing any objection.
I'll make that note too.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Doug, are you okay with doing it?
Yeah. As long as I have permissions, I'll do it. Yep. All right. Next, a real topic. Issue 802, names of plants and service classes. Now, I know not everybody was on the call yesterday, but I did walk through a couple people through this proposal that I want to talk through now about how to deal with names and changing of service plans and service classes. And let me paste a link to the proposal on there. Morgan, do you want to share that, or do you want me to share my screen? Oh, there we go. Okay. So go ahead and go to the next page. So just let everybody know, the issue here is how to deal with the fact that the service catalog spec, the open source broker API spec allows service classes. Oh, I'm sorry, yes.
I think Paul put a hand up about the previous point.
Oh, sorry, okay.
I just wanted to say, I think this is one of the trickiest, most insidiously complex problems that we have to deal with, and I really would like us, before we feel as though we've made a final decision, to get some feedback from one of the owners, because I'm not at all sure. I'm not at all positive what they will say about either of the approaches that we have on the agenda for today.
Oh, not about the previous point. Okay. Well taken. Thank you for that, Paul. Are we good to continue?
You're welcome, and yes.
Cool. Sorry, Doug. Go ahead.
All right, not a problem. So just to recap, this issue is about service class names can change and plan names can change. And obviously, that means that we probably cannot use those as the Kubernetes names of those resources because Kubernetes does not allow you to change the name. So in thinking about this problem, just a quick summary, I'm not claiming Paul endorses this, but this is a result of a conversation that Paul and I had. So not claiming anybody likes it or hates it, just who is part of the conversation. So in order to attack this problem, I thought it'd be best to start looking at plan names first, because I think it's a little easier to focus on those. So as we walk through these slides, we're going to touch just on plans first. And my assumption here is that plan names must be unique across all plans within a given service. So they're not globally unique, they're just within the service, which means that the same plan name can be used by more than one service, which just goes to reinforce the fact that we actually cannot use the plan name as its real Kubernetes name going forward because it's not unique. And just to be clear, as Paul alluded to earlier, there is no right answer for this. So ultimately, in all these conversations we're about to have, we're looking for the least bad solution going forward. So don't expect this to be anybody claiming this is perfect. Okay, so moving on. Next slide, Morgan. Actually, jump forward too. All right, so let's take a look at what I think we want the user experience to be like for creating a service instance. In this particular case, there's a MySQL service out there, and there's a plan called free associated with it. We got this from the broker, so it's not under our control. But I believe what we're showing here on the screen is basically what we'd want the user experience to be, meaning the user provides us their own name for their instance, their namespace, but we want MySQL and free to be what appears inside the service instance, because that's what the broker gave us, and I think that'd be the ideal solution, okay? So the key point here is this is using the real human readable names, not something else that we've either manufactured or, God forbid, even the ID that's associated with these things. That's the last thing we want to do. So as I said, I think this is the ideal UX. All right, so moving forward. All right, so if someone was to do a put using the previous YAML, and then they were to turn around and query the service instance, with my proposal, this is what they would see back. And the stuff in red are the new fields that would appear. Everything in black was basically what the user provided. So let's walk through these one at a time. First would be a plan ref, which is nothing more than an object reference to the service plan that free is associated to, or free represents. External ID is the UUID that we use to create the instance with the broker. That's as it is today. And the only thing that's really sort of new here, aside from the ref plan, or plan ref, is the actual plan name, and that's set to free. And the way to think about this going forward is the plan name versus actual plan name are kind of similar to what pods have, or not pods, replica sets have, with relation to the number of instances you've requested for the replica set versus the actual pods of the replica set, right? So in this case, what we have is the user asked for the free plan, and then the actual plan name in the status section represents the current state of the world as viewed by the broker, meaning he agrees. This thing's called free. Okay, so those two fields perfectly align and everything's great. All right, any questions on that so far? All right, so go forward 2 steps, Morgan. So actually just 1 step, sorry. So what happens now is, let's say what happens when the broker updates his plan name to no cost instead of free, for whatever reason. Okay, so now let's go to the next slide. What's gonna happen here, and this is strictly from the user's perspective, I'm not talking about what we do under the covers when we detect this. This is just from the user's view. What they're going to see if they query that service instance is actual plan name changes to no cost. Everything else remains the exact same. So again, the difference here between plan name and actual plan name represents what the user originally asked for versus what the view of the world is from the service broker's point of view, or the real environment. That's probably the part of this proposal that's a little bit weird, if you want to use an adjective to describe it, is that the plan name and actual plan name can be out of sync because what the user provided us does not match the reality of the world as it stands today. But that's actually completely accurate with exactly what happened, right? The user asked for one thing, but the state of the world is something different. So the user can see the historical view of what's going on in terms of what they asked for and the real world. Any questions on that? Okay, moving on. I'm trying to go a little fast because I don't think this is terribly complicated. So now let's say what happens when the user says, okay, I want to upgrade my plan from free to gold. They look at the YAML, they change the plan name to gold and do a put. So let's go to the next slide, see what that looks like. So here, they get exactly what they would expect. The plan name as provided as input is now gold. The plan ref will now be updated because they're now pointing to a different plan than they were before. In particular, they're now pointing to the gold plan. And the actual plan name is gold as well, because that's the state of the world. All right, moving forward. If they were to actually list the service plan, so this gets a little bit to what's going on under the covers, what they'll see is the Kubernetes name for the service plan is the actual ID. So even though we're using the static name, the static ID for the Kubernetes name, notice the user hasn't actually seen that in their normal workflow. They kind of have to go out of their way and dig under the covers a little to actually get exposed to this ugly ID. But normally they should not have to see it at all, which is exactly what we want. The only other thing that's kind of interesting here is the service class ref of the service plan will point to obviously the service class itself, and it will point to that by service ID rather than service name. And that's sort of a heads up to where I'm going with this, meaning I want to use the exact same a mechanism for service class names as well, not just plan names. All right, going forward, I don't see any hands up. So if you were to actually list the two service plans that we know about, what you'll see are these two things here, right? You'll see metadata.name for the no cost one is an ID, not no cost. Notice external ID now is duplicate information. So I would suggest that we actually look to remove that field because I don't think we need it anymore. And if we do adopt the notion of service classes using the same mechanism, then the service class ref will just have the ID for his name as well. And the exact same thing happens with gold. All right, keep going. So under the covers, what's really happening here? As I mentioned, what we're talking about doing is, let's talk about what happens when you do a relist and the controller notices a rename. So what we're going to do is we're going to update the service plan.name with the new name. And it's important to understand this is not the Kubernetes name. We already have a name field that's in the spec section, and that's the one I'm talking about. I'm not talking about the Kubernetes metadata.name. And what we'll then do is we'll go through and find all service instances that reference this plan and update the status.actual plan name to the new name. Okay. Now, it's important to note here that the field that we're touching is not in the spec, so we're not changing the user's data on them per se. What we're changing is the status, and that's allowable for us to modify. Now, obviously going through and touching every single service instance that references a plan may be a time-consuming process or expensive from that perspective. But I don't think it's critical that this change happen instantaneously across all instances. It can be an eventual consistency type of action, because this field called actual plan name isn't really used for anything. It's informational purposes only for the user, just to give them the state of the world. They don't ever really need to use it, so it's not that big a deal. But I don't expect this to take that long to update, so it's not a big problem in my opinion. The most important thing though is when we detect the name change, that going forward, if the user does try to use that plan going forward, they have to use the new name, meaning no cost, not free. And that will be instantaneous. That's, I think, is really the only requirement that we have going forward here. All right, any questions on that? All right, next slide. Mark.
Instantaneous one more time?
What will be instantaneous is the plan name change will be instantaneous. So if the minute we notice, I'm sorry, the minute the relist is done, if the user tries to use a plan, they have to be using the new name, not the old name, because that's what the broker knows about. So if they were to list out the current plans for a particular service, they will see the new name immediately, not the old name. Okay.
Okay.
Which will happen automatically. It's just the twiddling of the existing service instances might take a couple of seconds depending on how many there are. All right, so moving forward. Morgan. All right, so what I mentioned earlier is I'd like to do the exact same thing for service classes. So inside the service class resource, the Kubernetes name field will be its ID, and the name inside the spec field will be the human readable name. So go forward, what does that mean for a service instance? Notice here, the stuff in red is what's new beyond what we talked about earlier. Service class ref will point to the service class itself, probably by ID. And then the actual service class name will be the human readable name, MySQL. That way, if the service class name changes, the user can see the class name that they originally asked for versus the new class name. So it's the exact same mechanism. All right, moving forward.
It looks like the same mechanism.
It is the same mechanism, as I said, yes. Okay. Let me pause here and make sure there aren't any questions. I know, Paul, your hand's up, but before I start talking about additional suggestions or open questions that sort of came up after yesterday's or during yesterday's phone call, I wanted to sort of pause here because I think these are all additive things that we could do if we like this general direction. So I don't want to sort of confuse things by going too far, too fast. So let me take some questions first. I guess, Paul, you're up first.
I can think of how this breaks kubectl apply, which I realized only since you started talking about it here. I think that I'm personally going to need more time to think about this one. And I like I have said earlier, I think that I also wrote up another different proposal that I'll describe after you're done. And I think it would be good if we could take both of those, because I think that they're probably the two ways we could try to skin this cat and see what the owners thought.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Can you elaborate a little on how you think apply breaks?
Yeah, so like, so for reference, what apply does, what kubectl apply does, is you point it at a file, and it makes sure that what is in that YAML file is in the API server. And so what you could do is you could say that you have a file with a service instance, and you use that either with apply the first time or use it with kubectl create. And so now your service instance is in there. And then broker changes the name of a plan. And now your YAML file has the old plan name. And when, say that you change the parameters, inline parameters on the instance, and you run kubectl apply again, it sounds to me like you would get kicked, that the update request would be forbidden because it's using the old plan name. Is that right? No,
actually, I think we'd be okay because, and actually, we talked a little bit about this tangentially yesterday. If someone, let's actually change your scenario slightly first. Let's say someone notices that plan name and actual plan name are different. If they wanted to, they could do a put to the service instance and change the plan name from free to no cost. We should be able to look at that and detect it and say, okay, that's a no-op, and allow it to go through. Because we know what the real plan name is, right? So if you take that the next step further, if someone gets the YAML from the service instance and it still says free, and they update the parameters, when they do the put or the apply as you're suggesting, we could look at that and say, okay, when I send my update to the broker, I know what the real plan name is. It's no cost. Forget the fact that the user originally put free. We know what the real plan name is. It's no cost. That's what we use on the request to the broker, and I think everything works just fine. And at the same time, we could choose to update the plan name in the spec or not. That's sort of up to the user to decide if they want to update that.
Yeah, so I guess my only suggestion would be to give some more treatment to that scenario so that it's clear that this proposed solution addresses it.
Okay, that's not a big deal. Like I said, I don't think it really changes anything because we have all the right information to send to the broker, so I don't think the broker should barf on anything. So let me just now talk about some of the things that we talked about yesterday in the call. So I think Vile suggested or questioned whether actual plan name and actual service name might actually be generated fields. That way we don't have to worry about this notion of a time delay between a relist and user seeing the new value. So that's something else for us to consider. We might be able to make those generated fields. I'm not sure what kind of impact that has. I know, Paul, you've had some concern about generated fields in the past.
They break watch.
Yeah, that we did mention that one yesterday. Yeah, for those of you who don't know, watch will not work on generated fields because I believe that watch acts or does its business on the database side of things, not on the output of a get. And it's during the get processing that we would actually do the generation of this field. So I think yesterday when we talked about this, we acknowledged that would be a problem, but we weren't sure how big of a problem it was because we weren't sure how many people would actually want to watch the actual plan name. But it is, from a pure architecturally pure perspective, you are correct. It would break watch. The other thing we talked about was, I think this was from Aaron yesterday, he was saying that one thing we may want to consider is because there could be a time delay between the relist and all the service instances being updated, perhaps we should have some sort of dirty bit on the service instances so that the user can see that this migration of all the service instances is underway. And hopefully, Aaron, the nested bullets there shows the exact flow that you were thinking of yesterday, which is we detect the plan change, we go through, mark all the instances as quote dirty or change underway or something like that. And then we actually go through and update the service plan on the service plan itself, the plan name on the plan itself. Then we go back and actually touch all the instances. I think that was the flow you described. Okay, thank you. Yep. So that's something else we can consider. I think Aaron also wondered whether we should include a timestamp on the service class and the plan to indicate when the name changed, in case that's interesting to some use cases. And then, of course, what I mentioned earlier is if we do go down this path, we can remove the external ID property. So I'd recommend we actually do that. And then I think Vile mentioned, should we move some of these fields, in particular external ID, service plan ref, and service class ref, into the status section, since they're not under the end user's control, they're more managed and owned by the controller itself. So they may make more sense to be under the status instead of the spec. Any questions on those? I don't think any of those fundamentally change the proposal. They're just additive things we can consider. All right, so let's go to the next I think this is the final slide, one more. In terms of the current issues, obviously 802, I think this directly addresses that. 868. If we remove the external ID, then I think we can close with no action 868 since the field goes away. If we do keep external ID, then yeah, I think it was Paul that suggested we could just create an admission controller to block updates to external ID to make sure no one else can update it, including the service controller, I think. But anyway, my proposal would be to drop external ID anyway and just close it. But anyway, I think that's the whole proposal and discussion.
Cool. So we've got Paul. I think, Paul, you have two hands up. Not sure if you addressed the first one. So
The first thing was that I think we should close 868 because it will necessarily be addressed as part of the eventual solution to issue 802.
Well, I'd rather wait till we have the solution first before we close it, just in case we're wrong. But yeah.
Okay.
Cool. Any other reactions, comments, objections, etc. on this proposal? Going once.
Stunned silence.
All right. So sounds like we might need a day or so. Maybe since we're not going to meet tomorrow, maybe the weekend to think about this. And we also had on the table bringing this to some of the Kubernetes owners to see what they think and possibly get sign off.
Yeah, I don't think we should consider any consensus on this binding until we get approval on at least one option to choose from. And I have an alternate to this that is also on the agenda.
So I'd like to put an action item out there for this proposal and for the other one, Paul, for yours, for you guys to go and bring something or some things to the owners to get their take and then bring it back so we can all get consensus.
Yeah, I think that sounds reasonable.
Doug?
Yeah, that's fine. Who are, quote, the owners?
People in the top level owners file of Kubernetes.
Ah, those guys. Okay, thank you.
All right, so I'm going to put this down. This is Doug and Paul to bring this and other proposals to the top level Kubernetes owners. All right. Is that just about accurate, Doug and Paul?
Yeah, that looks right to me. I would like, though, before we do that, I'd like to make sure that, or I'd like to see whether this group has a preferred approach going forward. To be honest, if as a group we prefer one approach, but then the other guys go for a different direction, I think that'd be bad.
Okay.
So I'd like to see if we can come to consensus, at least within our group, not necessarily today, because I do think people need at least the weekend to think about it, but maybe on Monday before we go up the chain, I'd like to see if we have consensus within our little group itself first.
Okay. So Paul, is your proposal on the agenda for today?
Yes, it is on the line below the first line under this.
Got it.
It says ultimate proposal.
All right, I will remove this action item and put an updated one after we go over your other proposal.
Okay.
All right.
So Morgan, you want to open that? Click
So,
that link.
just 1 second. So are we all, does anyone have anything else on this proposal, what Doug has presented? Going once? Okay.
Which link?
All right. Go ahead,
The
Paul.
one that says alternate proposal.
Okay.
Okay. You might want to bump the font up a little bit.
Yeah, please.
Okay, so assumptions that I should air before I talk through this are that name changes of services and plans are deprecated as we agreed to in Open Service Broker API face-to-face, and that means that we don't have to accommodate them in a first-class way. And another assumption from a email thread that we had with SIG architecture is users should never have to look at non-human readable names of services or plans. And so if you will scroll down a little bit, yeah, there we go. Scroll back up, There we go. Okay, so the proposed changes are that we take all of the existing fields on service class and service plan and move those to new spec structs and add status to service class and service plan. That we retain the existing external ID fields and ensure that these values are immutable for a particular, for a service and plan. And that we make the Kubernetes names of service class be broker name dash service class name, or service name. And that we make the Kubernetes names of service plan broker name dash service class name slash service plan name. And that we add a new status.inactive Boolean field to service class and service plan. And so if the broker changes the name of a service, we set the status.inactive field on that service class, set a status message saying that the service has been renamed, and do not allow new instances to be created of this service. And then basically the similar semantics for plan. So if the broker changes the name of a plan, we'll set the status.inactive field on that service plan and set a status message saying the plan has been renamed. Do not allow new instances to be created on that plan. Service instance keeps the same fields and uses the full Kubernetes names to reference service class and plan. And then if you scroll down, Morgan, there are like proposed API changes so people can see what this would look like. And I forgot to add the, oh no, originally when I started writing this up, I had inactive on spec. I moved it to status. So let's look at the example. So say that you have a broker, test broker, whose catalog contains a service test service with plan example plan 1. You'd get the following resources. So you'd get a service class with the name test broker test service and all of the current fields that we know and love under the spec. And you get a service plan called test broker test service example plan 1. With all of the fields that we're familiar with under spec. And then if you scroll down just a smidge more, a service instance referencing these would have in the spec service class name, test broker test service, plan name, test broker test service example plan 1, which I will reiterate that I do not think there is a perfect solution. I think these APIs are deeply and profoundly mismatched. The following bold in the next sentence is a symptom of me thinking it was funny to make them bold at like 2 in the morning when I was writing this up. So know that that's my attempt at humor, and say that if a broker is poorly behaved and intentionally uses to use deprecated behaviors and renames example plan 1 to example plan 2, then we would get the following. We'd have a good old brief and to the point name test broker test service example plan 1 would have status inactive as true and have a message saying this was renamed to test broker test service example plan 2, just rolls right off the tongue. Not a lot of work to say. Say it once, say it twice, say it as many times as you want. And I have another service plan, test broker, test service example plan 2, with the fields that we're familiar with. So basically, the difference between these two approaches are that the one that I'm suggesting makes basically does not attempt to achieve something like visibility into there was a name change that's on the instance, although I guess we could make an additive change to this and say that when this happened, we might put some piece of status on the instance. But I'm going to stop talking now. I see, Vila, you have a question or something to say. Remember, we're being recorded, so you should hold all things you wouldn't want to say in front of the internet for later.
Never mind then. No. So it seems like one of the things that by doing the inactive and inactive message allows you to do is to go ahead and convey additional information rather than just rename, which I didn't see in the original. If you scroll up the problem statement, what problem are we trying to solve?
There isn't really one. I can go to the top of the issue, I guess.
No, yeah, is that?
Blah, blah, blah. The name change thing.
Yeah, so it's only the name change thing. But also, I don't remember if we talked about this in the context of the OSP face-to-face or if we talked about the Kubernetes, but there was some thought about how do we go ahead and deprecate versions or point users to a different version. So this plan allows for that to happen as well. I think it would be beneficial to capture that somewhere because you provide a solution, but you don't provide a problem.
You don't feel that what is on the screen right now articulates the problem?
No. I think that, for example, the inactive message is not necessarily captured in this one because basically we are solving a couple of things that is not just the rename. It also says this allows you to go ahead and roll forward a version, provide a pointer to it, and everything else. This one just says a broker can change the name willy-nilly. And the problem we are trying to solve is because we map those names to kube resource names, which are immutable. And both of these solutions that are proposed solve those as well. I would also like to capture the additional problem or requirement or whatever the heck it is to go ahead and say, we also would like to go and provide other things to it. Because otherwise, we wouldn't need the inactive reason, right?
I think, Doug, you and I could probably work together and come up with a list of all the problems we're trying to solve and state maybe a little bit more clearly for.
And that is, I'm sorry, that is not meant as a criticism. I'm just saying the solution is way more complex than what the original problem statement is. I think it's an elegant solution. We talked about that in the face-to-face, as in it's a very good use case we should support. I would like to make sure that we have a concise statement of all the things we are trying to solve with this, and I think we can solve them with this one particular approach.
Cool. I put a hand up. I also agree this is a pretty elegant solution. My only issue is with the naming. So sorry, Doug.
That's okay.
Please, I missed that. Please go ahead.
No, go ahead and finish.
I'm pretty much done. The naming here, because it includes the broker name, it feels a little bit, it is a little bit less portable across different environments that run different brokers, but those brokers provide the same services. That's
So
it for
unfortunately,
me.
service class names or service names are only unique within a broker's catalog. Wah, wah.
No, I'm talking about instances referencing a service class, a Kubernetes service class resource. So in that case, the Kubernetes service class resource names will be different across different brokers. That's my concern.
I don't understand.
Different clusters where the broker has been added with different names. Like I called it Azure and Jerry called it Azure with 2 R's.
That's right. So the two different service classes will be named differently.
If you install the broker in the same chart as the rest of them, I guess it doesn't matter, but yeah, I guess in a chart you might have to say, here's what I call this broker, and use that to generate these things in line, right?
So yeah, that's all for me. I like the way that the indirection works. If a plan or service is deprecated, you can follow it to the non-deprecated newer one. I like that. So that's it for me. Sorry about skipping you, Doug. Please go ahead.
Yep, not a problem. So, Vile, I think what you're talking about there is something that's much broader, and I don't think either of these proposals are actually trying to address it. That whole notion of versioning of these things. I think I agree with you that we did talk about that at the face-to-face, but I think that's something that has to be solved at the spec level, not as part of this, because the current version of the spec, when it talks about a name change, they're not doing it as some sort of versioning thing. They're doing it just because they treat the name as just sort of as just a human readable thing. It's not meant to be something that's set in stone, right? It's almost like a description field in a sense, right? It can be easily changed. And so it's important to understand that the inactive, inactive message or whatever that thing is that Paul had in his, that's simply there for people to follow the link if they ever need it for some reason, right? It's not, I don't think, meant to represent some sort of versioning scheme, right? So I think it's an important distinction there. And if we want to try to address the problem that you're describing of
Did we lose Doug?
I don't hear Doug.
I'm sorry, I hit the mute button by mistake. I think that's something we need to address in the spec if we actually want to talk about a real versioning scheme. I think it'd be a big mistake for us to try to add that to our stuff when the spec itself doesn't even talk about that. Now, to the proposal itself, what worries me about this is twofold. One is asking people to do concatenation of the names, I think, is not only just kind of hokey, it's actually very problematic, because if people start using dashes in their names to begin with, then the potential for overlap between brokers, services, plan names to match a previously existing one in the system goes up. And so I think we're asking for potential conflict in the future. Whether it's a big one or small one, I don't know. But the fact that we're just going to do string concatenation on these things and ask the user to perform these things, have to duplicate the service broker name in multiple places just so they can do a string concatenation, I don't think is a good user experience. That's why I prefer the approach I gave, because it gives us the exact user experience we want people to have without any potential risk of conflict whatsoever. And that to me is the most important thing, is user experience in all of this. If we have to jump through hoops under the covers, that's our problem. But as long as the user experience is nice, that should be what matters most. So I'm done. Thank you.
Aaron, is there a direction?
I think we're in the same state
I was
we're
muted.
in, right?
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I was muted. Apologies, Morgan. Yes, you are next. Go ahead.
Multiple points, I guess. I don't see how this is any better than this. You can say, that's the broker name, and but it's not going to say broker here. It's not going to say service here. It's not going to say plan here. It's going to say, Exxon MySQL free or something. It's not going to look as pretty as this looks, as the example looks.
Did you say Exxon?
I needed to come up with somebody who's providing a service, man. So I don't see how that's more user friendly than just a unique whatever is. First of all, second, this is ridiculous. It's too long. No.
That's not a reason.
Yeah, that's kind of a reason. There's definitely These get put into labels sometimes, and things get funky when you do that. We've already seen that.
Entire object specs get serialized and slammed into labels too.
I mean, as
let's
the
keep it
keys,
to-
as the key.
Let's keep it to one person at a time.
But yeah, and then whatever Doug said was pretty good. Aaron said a point of you can use this to follow the updates. I missed the explanation of how to do that. Or is that in this thing? Is that this part?
I was referring to the inactive message.
Okay, well that's not necessarily. I mean, I guess we're setting that so we can choose to have that, but that isn't guaranteed to be that. That wasn't specified in this thing, as far as I can tell. So if you want to make it specified, updated to. It's not a message; it's an actual field updated to, pointer to the next plan. That makes sense. Otherwise, I disagree with that statement. But okay, done.
Cool. Kibbles, you're up next. Go ahead.
So I wonder about how the second approach would deal with like the default plans of services, because I feel like default is something that you could definitely have multiple plans be named default at like different times, but because you're using the that concatenated string as the Kubernetes resource name, that could get us into a lot of trouble. Like if at one time there was a default plan and then it no longer became the default and a new one became default. So I'm curious to hear the answer there.
I think that the semantics of the emission controller you're referring to would probably have to change to if there is one plan that is not inactive.
So I don't mean the like default. I mean literally the string default. Like if then like because that's kind of a name that you could see bouncing around, in my opinion.
I am still not sure what you mean.
So there's a plan in the service class called default. So you have like default light premium or something, and then the broker manager decides to change that. So like, let's get rid of the default plan. Let's change light to be our default. So they rename light to default, and then it's just default and premium. So the name changed, but the Kubernetes name, we're going to have a conflict there if we mark one as inactive, but then we want this other, we're creating a new one that has the exact same resource name as the old default.
So you're talking about if there are name changes multiple times and you like rename default to not default and then you rename it to default again?
No. So let's go, we have 3 plans. We have light, default, and premium under one service class. Then we decide we don't like the default plan anymore. We're getting rid of that. Light becomes our new default now. So the service broker decides to rename light to default and get rid of the default plan, and or mark it as normal or something. And so now light's new name is default.
I think this is a case in point of why renaming services and plans is extremely user hostile.
Yeah.
I don't have a good answer for it. I don't think anybody should ever do it. And I think it's a terrible thing to do to users is my response to that.
Okay, but this situation would break down in that case, right?
Yeah, yes, it would.
Okay. Just wanted to throw that out there.
Right, and I'll say for the record, this is not an attempt to comply with infinity renames because I don't think that we should allow those. I view it as a major weakness of the spec, And like the prior guidance that I've gotten from Brian Grant is that we do not need to necessarily accept all of the shortcomings of the spec. We should move to make the spec better and do what is right for us, assuming that we don't get ahead of the spec. But I think after Open Service Broker API face-to-face, we all agreed this was deprecated. I made a pull for it yet. It's not merged, but it will be shortly, hopefully.
Okay. So quick time check. We've got 7 minutes left. We've got 3 people on the queue. So this is probably going to be the last item we talk about. With that, Paul, I have you next on the queue. Do you have more to say?
I just want to know where we all send the bill to Cloud Foundry for the amount of time it's taken to discuss this.
Yeah, maybe put your Bitcoin wallet address in the issue. Okay, Doug, you are up next. Go ahead.
Yeah, so just to sort of follow on with what Kibbles was saying, because I never actually got to this. It was in my original slides. One of the reasons that I don't like this approach is because once a broker chooses a name for like a plan, as long as that plan continues to be used by somebody in some platform to which that broker is registered, they will never, ever be able to reuse that plan name. And that places, in my opinion, a really large burden on the broker going forward that is not part of the specification. And that creates quite a large interoperability issue, because that means a broker that today can be registered with Cloud Foundry and reuse an old name that they happened to use 3 years ago may not work with Kubernetes going forward, because we've kept around this old plan name and the plan name has been deprecated or marked as inactive, but because someone's still using it in our system, we won't allow them to register their broker with us anymore, or allow the relist to go through. And I think that's a problem going forward. But I just want to point out that even if Paul's PR for the deprecation of allowing renames goes through, it is just deprecated. It's not flat out banned, which means it is a valid use case that we know some brokers do use today. We don't know whether it's a large or small percentage of them, but we do know it does happen today, which means all those brokers will not be able to work against Kubernetes going forward, or they'll have this issue going forward. So I just want to point that out.
Cool. All right. Vile, you maybe have a hand up, so go ahead if you do.
Well, yeah, I mean, I do again think that, and maybe I'm just beating the dead horse. I feel like we have simplified some of the assumptions and some of the constraints that we have in solving this problem. Because I've heard a couple of times, like, you know, in this case, the one of them was users should never see GUIDs. And then one of the things I heard later on is, well, users shouldn't see these things with the metadata names. And I think the better way to go and say is you can't confuse them. But I'm not sure if they are really requirements, but you could certainly see where in this case you could have I don't know, broker code test, and the broker test service would be named the plan, an example plan. So I was expecting that the dashes were just examples, and we would choose a delimiter that was not allowed in the
Can't.
In the what?
I mean, the name is that's it. It's letters and dashes. That's it.
Okay, well, whatever. I guess we'll use Unicode turd as the delimiter.
Vile, it's like we were separated at birth, man. I was thinking the poop character too.
That's not a letter or a dash. So.
Well, yeah. Anyway, so I feel like we are kind of doing this. I kind of feel like we as we are talking through these things, there's a couple of things that are coming in that are not necessarily stated, and I feel like they need to be gathered somewhere. They are gathered in this recording that nobody's ever going to look at.
So
that's my dead.
So we have 2 minutes. The one thing there's two things I've heard here. One is we need to consider these two options more. before we go into the owners and ask them what they think. 2, we need to have a better list of requirements, is what I've heard. Are there any disagreements to that?
No.
Okay, going once. Anybody else? Okay, I'll write up some action items there. I'm going to assign them to Vile, Paul, Doug, and myself, and we'll solicit others to join. I will also take an action item to move the orphan mitigation and scope of service CAT resources into Monday's meeting. And also, I will echo Morgan's plea to review pull request number 1106 because I know that hasn't been mentioned yet. The link there is in the agenda. With that, is there any other business that someone would like to cover in 1 minute? Going once. Okay. So this will be the last meeting of this week. We'll see everybody on Monday. Thanks all.
See ya.